Good evening, everyone. Let me start by apologizing for not being able to speak to you in German. And second, let me thank Dr. Corinne Flick and Professor Jens Beckert for Corinne's invitation and for their very kind introduction. So let's jump right in. The question may be a little bit provocative. Is there an optimal level of inequality? Or how should we think about what we are after, what society should seek to desire and seek to promote in terms of the distributional question that Jens already talked about? Okay, so first let's start with a basic fact, which is that the extent of income inequality varies a very great deal in the world. I'm sorry, this graph was originally vertical. I can see some of you tilting your heads, but it just didn't fit in the slide, so there it is horizontally. It gives you the Gini coefficient, which is a common measure of inequality. The Gini coefficient would be 0 if everybody had the same income. And it would be, am I using 100? Yes. It would be 100 if one person had all the income and everybody else had 0. So of course, an index of 100 doesn't exist anywhere because you don't have that situation where everybody has 0 except one person. And what you see here are estimates of inequality for a large number of countries, ranging from some of the most equal at this time, which actually interestingly include the Ukraine, but also Slovenia, Norway, and so on, all the way to the most unequal, which includes countries like my own, Brazil, also Colombia, Honduras, Haiti, South Africa at that very end. There are two colors in the graph. The blue color refers to measures of inequality of consumption, whereas yellow is inequality for income, and that's just because of what the surveys capture in different countries. People ask different, the surveys are different. You can see Germany there towards the less unequal end. And this already highlights one important thing. If you contrast this with the picture that Jens showed you, where you saw an inequality of wealth, that Germany was actually quite unequal in terms of wealth. And it is actually a known fact of the German society that it is quite unequal in terms of wealth. It's not very unequal in terms of income. And there are many interesting reasons why that is, which we can discuss in our conversation later, if you are interested. But the question then is, with this wide array of levels of inequality, is there an optimal one? And you might say the optimal one is 0. You might say there shouldn't be any inequality. But as Jens already told you earlier, inequality isn't the only thing we're interested in. We're also interested in levels, or what he described as growth, the question of do we want more or do we want less. We are also interested in things that have nothing to do with income or wealth. We're interested in people's rights and freedoms. Corinne talked about equality before the law and equality of rights, which is a different sort of aspect of this question altogether. Perhaps if we could keep all the freedoms and keep a very dynamic economy and keep a lot of growth and everything and reduce inequality to 0, then we would do that. But that's probably not possible, and I don't need to say this. In Berlin, a city, perhaps the only city in the world that was once divided between two systems, one of which was very actively trying to eliminate all inequality and perhaps not very successful in the end. The question is complicated because, as was already alluded to by the two previous speakers, what we are trying to achieve here, the normative question of social justice, of what makes a good society. This goes back to Plato and Aristotle, right? What do we want from a society? That will have overwhelming bearing on the question of what the distribution should look like. So this is what I mean here when I say that what the optimal level of inequality is cannot be answered on its own. You cannot answer that question independently of your views of what makes a fair society. And so it will depend, as I say there, on the normative views about what the social objectives are, what defines social justice. And what I want to do next is just spend a few minutes going very quickly over 4 important perspectives that perhaps have been dominant in the recent history of political philosophy, moral and political philosophy: utilitarianism, libertarianism, Rawls's theory, which is often referred to as Rosian liberalism. I will talk about Sand's capability approach. And in the end, that will lead me to a theory of equality of opportunity. Okay? In talking about these 4, which are, of course, vast subjects, I'm going to make reference to 2 particular concepts. One is in summarizing very, very narrowly, of course, very pithily, I hope, these theories, which are complex theories. I'm going to talk about the basal space, and this is terminology used by Amartya Sen again in a chapter in a handbook in 2000. I'm going to refer to the basal space of the theory. What is the theory concerned with? And then second, how does it aggregate information about that basal space over individuals? Okay, and this will become clearer as I go through it. Let's start with utilitarianism, which of course is the oldest of the 4 by far, and it goes back to Jeremy Bentham at University College London in the end of the 18th century. And you know, as Sen says, utilitarianism is so pervasive. Its influence over economists and others in the social sciences is so tremendous that it is often the theory that we invoke when none is explicitly mentioned. So you'll hear about people talking about what government should do or what society should pursue without mentioning any theory. And if you look at it, it's often going back to utilitarianism, okay, or some version thereof. What's the basal space? Well, as the name says, it's utilities. What are utilities? Different interpretations, but at the root of it, this idea of fulfilled desires, this idea of pleasure, well-being, fulfilled desires. For much of economics, we actually use it just to derive representations of choice, but let's leave that aside. Think of it as individual satisfaction as being what utilities really is. So this is what Jeremy Bentham and those that followed him were fundamentally concerned with. And how do you aggregate that across society? Who gets what? Well, simply a sum. You simply add utility among everybody else, and that's what society should maximize. A fair society should be the one that provides the most utility, quite regardless of its distribution. So people will often refer to utilitarianism as being supremely unconcerned with inequality or with distribution. And yet, let me pause to say for a moment that for a theory that is supremely unconcerned with inequality, it's actually interesting that utilitarianism, under its most common form, will actually generate an optimal solution that is equal in terms of income. And that is if people have identical utility functions and they are concave. That is to say, if everybody's utility goes up, but by less and less as you get more income, diminishing marginal utility. So you get happier with your first 10,000 euros. You still get happier with the next 10,000 euros, but less, and so on and so forth. If incomes are exogenous, if society just is about a pie that you distribute, then the optimal solution for that society would be to give everybody equal shares of the pie. That would maximize utility. Even though the theory doesn't care about the distribution of utility, the sum of utilities is arrived at, it's maximized when everybody gets the same. But that assumes that incomes are exogenous, that it's a pie, a given pie. Of course, that's not true. We must produce income. We must produce goods and services and sell them, and that generates the things that we consume and what our income buys. And so the issue is when we redistribute and when we tax some people and subsidize others, do we generate incentives and disincentives that might lead to a smaller pie, in which case that is a problem, right? And this is a fairly fundamental trade-off in economics. Many people have talked about it, but perhaps most famously Arthur Oken in this book in 1975, The Trade-Off Between Equality and Efficiency, talks about that big trade-off. Other people argue that utilitarianism, influential though it is not actually the answer to how we should govern our societies. And let me focus here on one book by Robert Nozick called Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which was an influential book, although there are other libertarian writers. Nozick says its fundamental problem with utilitarianism is that it focuses on end states. It focuses on these utilities, but that's not what makes society fair. He says what makes society fair are fair rules for the processes. We want a fair process. So his Basal Space is not as simple, just utilities. It's much more complicated, and it's hierarchical. First and foremost, he wants rights to be respected, and those rights, there's a wide range of rights, and he insists that there should be fairness in acquisition of wealth or assets or income, fairness in exchange, and if there have been past injustices, they should be rectified. I note there in the slide, importantly, that among the rights he considers are the rights of owning property and of bequeathing property. And this is what makes the theory, it tends to be considered on the right wing of the spectrum, because those rights to bequeath and own property are sort of sacrosanct here. And it's only after those rights are all respected, all satisfied, only after that then there may be a role for public policy, for the state, to be concerned with utilities and other outcomes. The fundamental thing, he says, is the respect of these rights with no trade-offs. Says libertarianism, it's quite different from another view that uses the word liberal, and so let me turn to Rawls. John Rawls, whose book, A Theory of Justice in 1971 is, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is the most widely cited book in philosophy and the social sciences of all time. And Rawls asked the question, Corinne talked about the social contract. He asked the question, what social contract would societies arrive at if individuals were behind the veil of ignorance? So suppose we are a society here, and we're going to be allocated to different positions, owners of land, industrialists, workers, agricultural people, whatever. What rules, what distributions would we agree ex ante before we knew which role we would play? This is an idea that goes back to Harsanyi, the veil of ignorance, right? And he argues in this book, John Rawls argues in this book, that so his Basal Space is primary goods, and he says, what would, I think a society that would try to arrive at a fair contract in this way, abstracting from people's own interests by thinking about what kind of arrangement might we want before we know our place in that arrangement, he says that would satisfy two principles. The liberty principle is something that our parents typically tell us, right? It says, you should aim for as much freedom as you can, provided it doesn't interfere with other people having the same freedom, right? So the most extensive liberty for each, consistent with other people having the same liberty. And then he says once that's done, so that's his liberties and rights there, he says then there should be the opportunity principle, equal opportunities for all in the acquisition of primary goods, and subsumed within that, this idea that's called the difference principle, which is quite an interesting one. Rawls says, look, what I want is not exactly equality. What I want is for the person who has the lowest to have the most possible. That sounds like equality, right? But it's not the same as equality if the size of the pie is different, for example. If the size of the pie is different, you might say, well, let's have everybody have the same, but then everybody ends up poor. Whereas if we have slightly less, maybe the person who has the least actually has more in scenario B than in scenario A. And that's a possibility. Two of the greatest economists of the last 50 years or so, Tony Atkinson and Joe Stiglitz, wrote a a textbook in 1980 called Lectures in Public Economics, which is quite a difficult textbook, but very influential one. And in it, they had this lovely picture. I just want to show you this. You know, it's kind of a production possibility frontier, if there are any economists in the room who studied this a long time ago. Remember how much you can produce. Here's a utility frontier. It says, well, suppose there is a society that looks like this. You know, there's one type of person here. Maybe this is, I don't know, somebody who's very clever and skilled. You know, these guys over here. And these guys over here are good at other things. Maybe they are like the workers or whatever. This is my interpretation. This is not Atkinson and Stiglitz. But they did draw this curve in such a way that, you know, it's not always downward sloping. It's possible, for example, that when these guys here, let's call them the agricultural workers, they have very little. Actually, these guys, the farm owners, they may get better if they pay a little bit more to the workers, right? It may be that everybody gets better for a while. You know, it's the efficiency wage idea. Yeah, if people are starving in your fields, they don't work so well, so you want them to be well-fed, you want them to have some health, and so, you know, this may be upward sloping for a little bit. What would these different theories, this is Atkinson and Stiglitz's representation of those theories, what would they look like? So suppose you start out at n. Ooh, sorry. Suppose you start out at point n. That's, let's call it the market allocation, the laissez-faire allocation. What happens without government, without any intervention? People are at n, which means that these guys have a lot and these guys have very little. What should society do to correct that, depending on the theories of social justice that they are interested in? Well, under Nozick, he says nothing. If those allocations were arrived at with fairness in acquisition, fairness in exchange, no past injustices, you know, people have rights to those properties, you shouldn't mess with it, just leave it there. It's the night watchman state, the minimal state, going back to, you know, the Leviathan. So nothing happens at n. A libertarian might want to leave that as it is. Now, if you're a utilitarian, you want to maximize the sum of utilities. The sum of utilities is maximized at b. That line over there is u1 plus u2 equals something. You move that line until it's a tangent, and that's where you get the sum, the biggest sum. So the biggest sum, Bentham would go over here. Okay? I didn't mention it in my utilitarian slide, but I had it there, that a transformation of utilitarianism is to say, okay, let's make it the sum, but let's make it the sum of a weighted sum, where the utility of the poor have a little more weight. So again, a concave transformation. Okay? That's associated with Bergson and Samuelson's utility functions, famous Paul Samuelson, and also with the philosophers' ideas of prioritarianism, the idea that you should give priority to the poor. With that, would move to U. So, you know, instead of B, U. So type 1 gets a little bit more. The poorer type gets a little bit more here. Rawls, which wants to maximize the min, says, look, over here the min is type 1. And you know, it could be type 2, but I maximize the min by being at R. Here is where type 1 gets the most. Okay? This is in contrast to a strict egalitarian who would choose this point. If we want zero inequality, the optimal inequality, if you wanted 0, this is where you would be. Yeah? That's the only place where it's equal. That's the 45-degree line. Rawls says, look, I want equality in every way, except if the societal arrangement that maximizes what's available to the poorest person is actually better than equality, which is that point. Okay? Moving right along, Amartya Sen, after whom my chair is named, and I'm very honored by that, proposed a slightly different approach, which some of you may have heard of, called the capabilities approach, which is actually, in some sense, sort of Rawlsian, influenced by Rawls. But Sen says, look, so the Basal space for Sen is different. He says, it's not about utilities. It's not even, he says, about rights and freedom. What we want is to maximize people's ability to flourish. And this may sound wishy-washy to you, but he's going back to Aristotle. He's going back to this Greek notion of happiness as eudaimonia. Some of you may remember from your classics that, hedonia, so satisfaction of desires is hedonia, from the word hedonism comes from there. Eudaimonia is this kind of, if you like, the good life, the idea of a fulfilled life. And that's the flourishing, which, is not utility, but it's kind of analogous to it. It's the end there. Oh, sorry. And how do you get there? He says, well, you get there by the things you are able to be and do. Those are the words of Sen. He says, you get your fulfillment by what you're able to do, but the person you're able to be, and he says those are your functionings. You choose your functionings from a set of possible functionings that you have, which are your capabilities. So this goes back to the example, Corinne's example of these two people watching the football match. So the shorter person is not able to watch over this fence. So her whole set of functionings is kind of curtailed in that way. So capabilities are different, and you have to interfere in that by giving them the larger box. Goods and services shape capabilities. And he says the basal space he's interested in is capabilities, the choice set of functionings, okay? All right, so with that, let me introduce then this economic theory of equality of opportunity, which is actually quite closely related to Sen. And I go back to the Senian slide just to say one problem with Sen's approach is that empirically, it has proved rather difficult to measure capability sets because they are, the potential things people might be and do. You don't observe that. So the equality of opportunity approach, like Sen's approach, sees a choice set rather than a specific point within that choice set as the individual maximum. It sees opportunities. Again, the ability for people to be and do things, right? So I refer here to Sen's Tanner lectures called Equality of What, because it goes back to my original question. When we ask inequality, what's the optimal level of inequality, the first question that probably crossed your mind was, well, inequality of what? If it's inequality of rights before the law, then there should be zero. If it's inequality of income, I don't know. Do I want to live in a society where everybody's forced to have exactly the same income? What would that entail in terms of freedoms and rights and productivity and all sorts of things? So this theory will allow for legitimate, acceptable differences in outcomes that are due to choice. I will define it in the next slide, but I want to say that it draws a little bit on all of the theories that we've talked about. It draws on libertarianism in the sense that it does take a concern with process into account. It doesn't matter how you arrive at the end state, not an end state it's alone. Obviously, it draws on Rawls a lot. And although it is described as a non-welfarist theory, it does draw something on utilitarianism because often it will use individual measures of advantage, like income, as a key part of the focal combination. So what is this theory then, equality of opportunity? The theory relies on two basic principles, which says if you're looking to move from a given allocation to one where there is equality of opportunity, you should compensate people for any differences in their outcomes. Let me just say income. Could be any kind of outcome, but let me just say income. You should compensate people for any income differences that are due to factors they could not influence, could not control, were not within their choice set, their responsibilities. So if there are differences that are due to race, or ethnicity, or gender, or place of birth, or family background, and this is where it gets very, very tricky, because we all know how important family background is. So any such differences, including potentially genetic differences, all of those that you had no control over should be compensated for. Once you compensate for that, if there are differences that are due to individual responsibility and effort, then those differences are okay. and should be allowed to stand. That's the principle of reward. What that means formally, if people like little bits of math, is that, look, there should be no differences due to circumstances. Circumstances, the things you don't control. So it's going to mean that conditional on circumstances, right? The distribution conditional on circumstances should be the same. Let me explain that a little bit more. What that means is that suppose you divide society, in groups of people that share the same circumstances. So you say, in the German society, I'm going to look at immigrants from parents with low education who were born outside the European Union. Immigrants with parents from high education that were born in the European Union. German natives that were born in the Eastern Länders. German natives that were born elsewhere with parents of this kind, parents of that kind, race, gender. You partition society into these subgroups, into types, Romer calls them, John Romer calls them. Then the distribution within those types, should be equal across the types. There still can be a distribution within the types. Within the types, the only things that vary is effort. It's okay. There could be some inequality, but not between the types. You can see already that, Corinne talked about equality of opportunity being challenged and people wanting equality of outcomes. But if you think of the example of Germany that I just gave, to have the same distribution of income across certain privileged groups as you do amongst immigrants, born from uneducated parents, would require a fairly radical transformation. So this is not a non-radical theory, this theory of equality of opportunities. It's due to people like John Romer, Dirk van der Gaar, Mark Flerbet, building on the work of philosophers, a number of philosophers, Ronald Dworkin, Richard Arnson, Jerry Cohen. We could talk a lot about that, but I don't have time. So let me move on and give you some examples of inequality of opportunity in practice, okay? So these are 2 brain scans of children aged 3. Comes from this work by David Perry, I think it was, in 2002, where he's looking in particular at the consequences for children of drug-taking parents. So he's using data on substance abusers. And here he compares the brain scan from someone whose parents were drug users and was a victim of extreme neglect during childhood. And this is a normal 3-year-old brain. And if you look at that, they're 3. Okay? So it's hard to say any of this difference is due to their own actions, right? And nonetheless, you can see if you look at it, in American society today, those 2 people would end up in very different places because of something they inherited which they don't control at all. That's inequality of opportunity. This is an example from Ecuador. As Jens said, I mostly work on developing countries. What you have here is a measure of vocabulary, the richness of words children know. So the vocabulary of children aged 3 to 6. This is in months, so these are aged 3 to 6. This is a sample in Ecuador. It's not a representative sample. It's a sample already from a poor neighborhood. But in that sample, they looked at the wealthiest quartile of the distribution and the poorest quartile of the distribution. They looked also at another cut, those whose mothers had 12 or more years of education, and those whose mothers had 0 to 5 years of education. Notice it's not their own education, right? It's the education of their mother, okay? Now, don't think that people are forgetting words. They're normalized at 100. So 100 is a reference population. 100 over there is the number of words that you'd expect the median child in a reference population to have. And what you see is that in Ecuador, the top groups, the top quartile or the children of the more educated mothers stay around 100. They have the number of words that you'd expect them to have in Spanish. This is called the Peabody vocabulary test from an article by Chris Paxson and Norbert Schad in the Journal of Human Resources. But the poorest groups diverge from them dramatically. Now, many of us, I think, when I was a student, I certainly thought, look, the way to promote opportunities through education. But the challenge of these 2 graphs, right, is that before they get to school, these are age 3, these are age, These are age 3 to 6. So before they start school, there are already massive gaps. Okay? And then they go to school, and these bars, I don't want to explain too much here, but this is from the PISA data, the data on school achievement from the OECD, Program of International Student Assessment. And the height of the bar here is the effect of one standard deviation in an index of family background. It's an index from questions in the survey about the education of your parents, how many books you own at home, cultural capital, social capital. It's an index of sort of family background, if you like, and the impact of that on the test score of the child is always statistically significant. It's very large in some cases. You can see there Argentina, Bulgaria, Peru at the very end, massive impact. Here, I'm afraid Germany does not come out so well. It tends to be towards the right end. And in fact, there's quite a lot of evidence on that, which I'm sure many of you will know more than me about. But you see, Germany has an unequal distribution of wealth. It also has a lot of influence of the parents on children, in part because of your tracking system, you know, your different tracks. It has a low income inequality because somehow you redistribute a great deal. That's my sense, but income. But that's, you know, I wait to hear from you. This is work we did. The yellow bars, Latin American countries that we were focusing on. And then, you know, so I'm following a life cycle here. You know, the babies, the 3-year-olds, 3 to 6, the vocabulary, preschool. This is at school. Your family keeps making you get better grades, okay, for various reasons. Not only because of what you learn at home, but because of sorting. They go to the better schools. They end up having the better teachers. They end up having the better peers because they're all together. And this is particularly so in developing countries where there are private schools where all the rich go. I know because I went to one. And then, you know, when you get to income, of course it makes a difference. So what these are cumulative distribution functions. You know, you may or may not be familiar with them, but to the right means good, okay? To the right means, and forget, these are just standard deviations. So this group is richer than this group, which is richer than this group. And, you know, you can see these lines are very, very different across the three countries. There's much less poverty in the bottom line, which is to the right. What are the groups? They are people's per capita consumption expenditure in their household in 5 Latin American countries, separated into 3 groups by the education of the mother of the head of the household. Not the education of the head of the household, which would not be so surprising, but a clear circumstance, something people didn't control, the education of their parents. And they're very unequal, as you can see, with people who had at least primary complete, you know, doing much better than people who had incomplete or none. So those are some examples of inequality of opportunity. Now I'm going to move from the examples back to a tiny little bit of conceptual stuff, but very simple conceptual stuff. What is, you know, the way that economists then model inequality of opportunity? I mean, you sort of see it. Right? You know it when you see it, kind of thing. You know there's inequality of opportunity. Can we kind of model it, think of it conceptually? And the answer is, we can. We just do the following. Let's think of people as being characterized by some outcome. I'm going to keep using income here, but it could be education or it could be wealth. Their circumstances, and then some index of effort. Effort is very difficult to observe, obviously, and effort depends on circumstances, which the theory allows for. So this is going to be the degree of effort relative to circumstances. And so the outcome is a function of circumstances and effort. Then you can kind of partition society in two ways. And let me just go straight to the figure. You can have a matrix like this, where the rows are what they call types. What are those? Those are people that have the same circumstances. So you remember the example I gave with the immigrants, with uneducated parents, you know, the sort of white native German men with highly educated mothers and fathers who worked as managers. You know, that's going to be the top group. These are circumstances. These are the types. The people who exert, the columns are people who exert similar degrees of effort defined in terms of being in similar percentiles of their type-specific distribution. And if you have questions about those details, we can talk about them later. You can use this theory here to measure inequality of opportunity. So, in a little while, in my last slide, I'm going to show you some measures of inequality of opportunity. They come from matrices like this. How do these matrices differ from straight utilitarianism? Straight utilitarianism would have a vector ordered from the lowest to the highest income. It wouldn't matter what circumstances you had. Having a matrix instead of a vector means that somehow now it matters your circumstances, right? Take a society that just has 3 rows for a moment, okay? So imagine a society that has 3 types, and plot those types as these curves here that I've made up, okay? What are these curves? They are called quantile functions. They are the inverse of cumulative distribution functions. They should be read like this. Here you've got the percentiles of the distribution within every type, okay? And there are 3 types, the green type, the blue type, and the whatever that is, brown type, okay? What is the normative theory of social justice and equality of opportunity? There are 2 basic approaches to this. Dirk van der Gaar said, look, what society should do, you see the echoes of Rawls in this, take the poorest type, take the value of their opportunity set, that is the income distribution they get, and let's arrange society so as to maximize that. That means pushing up the arrow here on the means, on the expected value. So this would be the poorest type, the way I've drawn it, the blue. What we want is to design society so that type does as well as possible. John Romer says something very similar. This is called the min of means. John Romer says, well, actually, the types may cross, so we want to, at every tranche here, we want to maximize things. So now we're getting to the end. I'm going to try and answer my question here of what the optimal level of inequality is. And in doing so, I'm going to put a potentially scary equation there. But don't worry about the equation. I'm going to deconstruct it all for you, okay? So in some work with François Bourguignon and Michael Walton, we said, let's actually make that a little bit more realistic. Because in this figure here, everything is static, right? There's no growth, no dynamics. All there is these 3 types, and you want to maximize things. In reality, there's investment, there's growth. And so we said, well, look, what we want to do with society is we want to choose a policy, phi. A policy, I mean a very large set of policies, regulations, laws, taxation, redistribution, okay? Which leads us to maximize the present discounted value of the lowest type, of the mean of the lowest type, over time. Subject, in addition, to nobody being below some poverty line, Z. So I'm saying here that the policy objective for the opportunity egalitarians should be policies from a permissible set that maximize the future stream of income or advantage for the most disadvantaged type, subject to a no deprivation constraint and to a policy acceptability constraint. Now, if that sounds complicated, here is what I hope helps, okay? So here are the elements of this. Bear with me. So this says, first of all, it says growth matters, because here are dynamics. Here, you're summing over time. You're summing the future over time. So you want to make a difference, in the future. And so you don't look just at that mean. You look at how those change over time. Who are you maximizing for? The lowest type. This is the Rosian Criterion, and this is what makes this quite radical. People who say, well, equality of opportunity, blah, it's too easy. No. I mean, think of, your immigrants that I talked about, or think of the poor Brazilian black people born in the slums through no fault of their own, with very uneducated parents and no wealth and so on. To get society to maximize their future expected stream of advantage is what we're asking for here. So this is quite radical, really, okay? Two additional bits here. One is this phi belonging to phi. Sounds like economic, nonsense, writing little Greek letters. What we mean by that is the following. That set is, of course, the set of feasible policies. You have to be able to afford them. There's a budget constraint. But in addition, it's not just that. It's socially permissible policies. So here's where a little bit of Nozick, and certainly a lot of Rawls and freedom, Rawls's liberty principle comes in, is that things you might do in society that would violate basic rights and freedoms, you may not include in that policy set. My favorite example, which students always laugh about, is, one thing that would make more equality of opportunity immediately in society would be to force the richest people to marry with the poorest people. That would do a lot because, in fact, men and women tend to marry, or couples of different genders tend to get together or marry or do whatever they want, very much in an assortative way. If you force them to marry somebody else, it would make a big difference to the future. But we don't want to do that. You don't want to tell people who they marry. That's ridiculous, right? So therefore, that policy is not in that set. You can't do that. So a lot of freedoms and rights that you may want to do, in addition to the budget constraint, are incorporated in that thing, okay? So, and the other thing, and I'm finishing, there's only one slide after this. This is important too. Some of the critics of this say, if you find a homeless person, who gambled their lives away, who drank too much, and therefore, through some fault of their own, ended up homeless in the streets. Are you saying that that's the reward effort and that they should stay there? Well, no. I'm saying the reward effort should be considered above some level Z. There may be a level, I'm calling it a poverty line, but society may decide we want the reward, we want a reward effort. But if somebody is too poor, too miserable, then it doesn't matter if they got there because of some background or if they got there because they made mistakes. We will bring them up to that level. So what's the optimal level of inequality in society? Well, it's obviously not as simple as picking a Gini of 0.23 or something. It is, in my view, I argue normatively, that it is the optimal distribution of incomes or other advantage variables, so the optimal level of inequality, are those which arise from the applications of that policy, phi star, the policy which maximizes that. You try to go for that. You try to make the poorest, the lowest type, the ones with the most disadvantage because of things they inherit. You try to give them the best chances in the future. The level of inequality you end up with is the optimal, okay? And what I want to say about that is that it's actually, in the end, probably not that unrelated with inequality of outcomes, right? So here, I have a graph of inequality in outcomes, income, and a graph of inequality of opportunity, which, as I said, comes from measures of the kind that I described earlier. And what you see is this upward sloping line, which some of you, certainly Jens, but many more probably, will recognize as a version of what's known as the Great Gatsby curve. The Great Gatsby curve, with Miles Korak came up with, has mobility here. It has mobility, intergenerational mobility here. Instead of having intergenerational mobility, I have a measure of inequality of opportunity, which allows me to say that those two concepts are actually very close, because mobility is what? Sorry, it has a measure of immobility, has a measure of the impact of your parents' income on your income. Of course, your parents' income is something you inherit. It's a circumstance. The difference here is that I have other circumstances too. I have race, I have place of birth, I have occupation. But income is obviously associated with all those things. So the notion of mobility and the notion of equality of opportunity are actually quite similar in some ways. And what the Great Gatsby curve shows you, either in the mobility version or in this version, is that there is a lot of correlation between outcome inequality and inequality of opportunity. There you see Germany, It's not so bad. It's doing all right. It's not yet Denmark or Finland or Norway or Iceland, but it's doing good. And look at the US over there. Look at Brazil and South Africa, right? Why should these be correlated? Well, they're correlated because obviously, if today's, as I say in the second bullet there, today's differences in outcomes shape tomorrow's opportunities. I mean, if one family is Elon Musk's family and another is the family of some Baltimore inner city resident, then that outcome inequality is going to shape their opportunities in the future. And vice versa, the opportunities will shape the outcomes in the future. And so it's not surprising that they are deeply intertwined. They are, as I say, two sides of the same coin. But by looking only at this line, you can't answer the question of what you should aim for, of what the optimal level is. I argue that to answer the question of the optimal level, you must look at this side, and in particular, you must sort of try and solve that complicated equation. And so, thank you very much.